Greetings, hypothetical students, and welcome back to the Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature Course series. Today we will be talking about the presentation of rural landscapes in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of both of these books, a few housekeeping general rules. This is a Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature Course series. If you don't know what it is, I will link down below an introductory video I did a while ago. But basically every 3 months on this channel I make a very long video talking in depth about two particular books and a particular theme that both of those books deal with. So today we're talking about rural landscapes in Far from the Madding Crowd and Wuthering Heights. Next time in April 2018 we will be talking about the theme of money in Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend and Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now, a video I'm very, very excited to make and already have a lot of thoughts on. But today we will be talking about these two brilliant books. The first half of the video, or to be honest for this one, probably slightly more than the first half of the video, will be spoiler free, and then in the middle of the video I will announce that from now on there will be spoilers and I will go into more spoilery territory. I have quite a lot to say about both of these, more than I always thought I would when I was reading them, so hopefully this video should be fairly interesting, let's hope. Anyway, before we begin, a little about both of these two books. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy is a very interesting novel in which we mostly follow a character called Bathsheba Everdeen. She is a female farmer. She runs a farm, but she's a woman, which is quite rare for a Victorian novel. This book deals with the way in which she runs the farm, but also with her relationships with 3 different suitors. Very, very interesting book, one I love a lot, and one that landscape is very, very interesting in because it affects everyday life so much, because nature and farming really, really drives the plot, and because a lot of the book takes place outside, which is something quite interesting that I don't think I'd really noticed before. So a lot to talk about in this one. And then Wuthering Heights, a wonderful book, one of my absolute favourites. This book focuses on 2 families, the Lintons and the Earnshaws. The Earnshaws live at Wuthering Heights and the Lintons live at Thrushcross Grange. And what happens when the family at Wuthering Heights, the Earnshaws, adopt a little boy called Heathcliff, who goes on to disrupt everything. The landscape is presented in a very interesting way. In this, we have a much more isolated landscape in a way. This book has a much smaller cast of characters than Far from the Madding Crowd, and this rural setting is one of isolation, of violence, of unsophistication, and at times of complete breaking of social codes. A really fascinating book and one that I love a lot. For clarity, before I talk about Wuthering Heights, in Wuthering Heights there are 2 characters called Catherine or Cathy. Both go by both names. When I say Cathy, I'm referring to the Catherine/Cathy of the elder generation. And when I say Catherine, I'm talking about the younger Catherine/Cathy, who is from the younger generation and is in the second half of the book. So Cathy is the elder one, Catherine is the younger one, just for clarity. Good? We're all good. Okay, so I have quite a few things to talk about today. In the first half of the video, in the spoiler-free part, I'm going to be first talking about sort of descriptions of landscape in both of these books. I'm then going to be talking about the way that rural landscapes and rural settlements are presented as being really isolated. I'm also then going to talk about the way that rural areas are presented as being somewhat rustic, backward and violent. I'm then going to talk a little bit about class in rural areas in both of these books, and then I'm going to finish up the spoiler-free section by talking a bit about the influence of nature, landscape and the weather on the plots and the significant events in these books. And then in the second half of the video, in the spoilery part, I will talk a little bit more about the influence of nature and landscape on the weather on the plot. I'll also talk a little bit about taboos in rural areas, and I'll also talk a little bit about the way that nature and the landscape influences the language in both of these books. And then I'm going to go on to a few conclusions. So yes, many things to talk about today, and let's get into it. One of the things that I find really interesting about both of these books is that they have a very different presentation of rural landscapes, and this is partly to do with the different landscapes they are presenting. Far from the Madding Crowd presents a landscape in the south of England, which is mostly cultivated farming, whereas the landscape presented on the Yorkshire moors of Wuthering Heights are much wilder and less cultivated than those in Far from the Madding Crowd. And I do think that whereas the landscape in Wuthering Heights is presented as being more wild, you get a much more picturesque and idyllic vision of rural landscapes in Far from the Madding Crowd. For example, if we take this passage. The road stretched through water meadows traversed by little brooks, whose quivering surfaces were braided along their centres and folded into creases at the sides, or where the flow was more rapid, the stream was pied with sprots of white froth, which rode on in undisturbed serenity. On the higher levels, the dead and dry carcasses of leaves tapped the ground as they bowled along, helter-skelter upon the shoulders of the wind, and little birds in the hedges were rustling their feathers and tucking themselves in comfortably for the night. It's interesting because you do have this moment of sort of darker imagery of the dead and dry carcasses of leaves, but for the most part this is a very nice image. There are little brooks and little birds, and the brook is flowing on in undisturbed serenity. This is a very pleasant landscape, and I do think that it's interesting how in Far from the Madding Crowd, in comparison to Wuthering Heights, this landscape is presented as being prettier but also more normal, more ordinary. It is part of everyday life, and partly because the landscape is a place of work. Work is done on the landscape, and that is how everyone in this book pretty much earns their money. Farming is a massively important part of the plot. If we look at Bathsheba's plotline, her character and her relationships and her unique position as a woman farmer, farming is so important to her personality and to what this book is going for. Although in many ways it is a love story and it is a story of a woman torn between three men, it is also a story about a woman farmer in the Victorian period, and that for me is one of the most interesting things about it. The rural economy and farming is massively important in Far From the Madding Crowd in comparison to Wuthering Heights, where the rural landscape is chiefly a place to ramble in and often get lost in. In Far From the Madding Crowd it is much more a place of work. And yet at the same time there are moments of real beauty in the landscape, and there are moments where the landscape in Far From the Madding Crowd is, as in Wuthering Heights, a little sublime. Northcombe Hill, not far from the lonely Toller Down, was one of the spots which suggests to a passerby that he is in the presence of a shape approaching the indestructible as nearly as any to be found on earth. It was a featureless convexity of chalk and soil, an ordinary specimen of those smoothly outlined protuberances of the globe that may remain undisturbed on some great day of confusion when far grander heights and dizzy granite precipice topple down. Again, it's an interesting and mixed description. On the one hand, Northcombe Hill is indestructible, on the other hand it's ordinary, and I do think you get that mingling of the ordinariness but also the sublime in the landscape in Far From the Madding Crowd. You find the same again in Oak's relationship with the world around him. Being a man not without a frequent consciousness that there was some charm in this life he led, he stood still after looking at the sky as a useful instrument and regarded it as an appreciative sight, as a work of art, superlatively beautiful. The idea of the sky and the natural landscape around you being both practical but also utterly beautiful. And again we see a varied and changing landscape in Wuthering Heights, although for the most part I think one that is slightly more imposing than the landscape in Far From the Madding Crowd. The very first lines of Wuthering Heights tell us that Lockwood is impressed by the landscape around him. 1801. I have just returned from a visit to my landlord, the solitary neighbour that I shall be troubled with. This is certainly a beautiful country. In all of England I do not believe that I could have fixed upon a situation so completely removed from the stir of society. Yet at the same time the descriptions of this landscape are often unpleasant. Lockwood talks about wading through heath and mud. The hilltops are bleak and the earth is hard with a black frost. From the very beginning of the book the moors are presented as being dangerous, a place where accidents could happen. I wonder you should select the thick of a snowstorm to ramble about in. Do you know that you run the risk of being lost in the marshes? People familiar with these moors often miss their road on such evenings, and I can tell you there is no chance of a change at present. The idea that someone could get lost on the moors and never be found is presented to us very early on in the book. Later, Lockwood bemoans, "Oh, these bleak winds and bitter northern skies and impassable roads." The idea that the landscape is impassable, that it is a barrier, that it is not something which makes life easier, that it is a practical tool, but something which often works against the characters. And yet at the same time, I do think we have a sense of the sublime beauty of the landscape. After it snows, Lockwood says that the whole hill back was one billowy white ocean. It's beautiful, although it is slightly terrifying and like an ocean a place of danger. And I think it's interesting as well to note how the landscape holds such an utter fascination for so many of the characters in this book. How Cathy, when she is ill, longs to be outside and thinks of the building she is in as being a shattered prison, and how Catherine loves to climb trees and works out how old she is by whether or not she is yet old enough to go to Penistone Crags. Both Cathy and Catherine, the landscape holds a fascination and they're always longing to be out in it. Moor is a place of danger, but it's also a place of fairy caves, of mystery and of beauty, and that sort of juxtaposition in Wuthering Heights of those two different possibilities of the landscape are really interesting. Another thing that's very interestingly dealt with in both of these books is the isolation of rural areas, a distance and differences from cities. For example, in Far From the Madding Crowd, the very title refers to the isolation of this area. Madding means frenzied or maddening. The idea that the community in this book is very far from the frenzied and maddening crowds of towns and cities. That title conjures up this image of calm, which I don't think is what we get in this book. Yes, it's far from the crowds of the city, but also a lot happens in this book. It is a busy book in terms of plot, and it often isn't a calm book. There are a lot of moments of massive stress here, sometimes to do with the actions of the characters and sometimes to do with the weather and the way the natural landscape affects people. To use the word mad in the title is quite interesting, especially for a book that deals in such a really interesting way with the theme of madness. Very early on in the book we get a scene of deep rural isolation when we first see Oak's hut. It came from the direction of a small dark object under the plantation hedge, a shepherd's hut, now presenting an outline to which an unintimidated person might have have been puzzled to attach either meaning or use. The image as a whole was that of a small Noah's Ark on a small Ararat. Later as well, we have a description of Wetherby as being as quiet as the graveyard in its midst. The living were lying well nigh as still as the dead. This is an isolated, very, very quiet place. It's the same in Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights as a book has a very, very small cast and quite a lot of slightly incestuous families. There are a lot of romantic relationships going on in this book between a very small amount of characters, between really only 2 families and 2 outsiders. Nellie Dean says to Mr. Lockwood, "We don't in general take to foreigners here." Mr. Lockwood has come from London. He's not from a different country, but to her, being from a city makes him foreign. All the characters in Wuthering Heights live very secluded lives, often with a very small circle of acquaintance. And at one point, Heathcliff asks Mr. Lockwood if he's tired of being banished from the world. This is a part of the country where everyone is in a way banished from the world. And we do get a sense in both of these books that the city is very far away and very, very different. In Far From the Madding Crowd, all of the characters in the book are from rural backgrounds, and the city doesn't often intrude into the book. We never visit it and it's rarely mentioned. And at one point Bathsheba goes to Bath, but we don't see her go to Bath. We don't go with her to Bath. Instead, we get a child's reported vision later on of having seen her in Bath in the past, and also her explanation to Oak later on of what she was doing in Bath. We don't get to go there with her. We never leave this rural landscape and we never go to the city. Joseph Poorgrass says, "The sky and the earth in the kingdom of Bath is not altogether different from ours here. 'Tis for our good to gain knowledge of strange cities." There's an odd contradiction here. Bath has the same sky and earth, it's not that different, but it's also a strange city. It's also other from where they are. In Wuthering Heights, the city is fairly distant. We have a mention of Mr. Earnshaw going to Liverpool at the beginning, but apart from that, the only character who really brings the city into connection with this landscape is Lockwood. He has come from town, he has come from London, and he comments a lot in this book about the differences between the life he led in town and the life he leads here. He complains about the fact that he can't get his housekeeper Nellie Dean to cook dinner for him in the evening, because in the country everyone eats dinner in the middle of the day and she can't understand the fact that he wants to eat dinner later in the evening. He finds it disconcerting at Wuthering Heights that they always go to bed at 9 and always rise at 4, very different hours to the city, because in the countryside the light and what needs to be done on farms tends to dictate when people wake up. So you do see in both of these books a real distinction from and distance from urban areas. Which leads me on fairly nicely to talking about the presentation of culture in rural areas, and the way that these rural areas in both of these books are presented as being rustic, in some way a little bit backward, and in Wuthering Heights really quite violent. Both of these books feel very far away from settled urban areas, and in a way they feel far away from the rules of settled urban areas, as I'll talk about a little bit more in terms of Wuthering Heights. But to begin a little bit with Far From the Madding Crowd, it is presented as being rustic, as a place where things haven't changed for quite a long time. The citizens then is the rustics now. In London 20 or 30 years ago are old times, in Paris 10 years or 5, in Wetherby 3 or 4 score years were included in the mere present, and nothing less than a century set a mark on its face or tone. 5 decades hardly modified the cut of a gaiter, the embroidery of a smock froth by the breadth of a hair. 10 generations failed to alter the turn of a single phrase. In these Wessex nooks, the busy outsider's ancient times are only old. His old times are still new. His present is futurity. The idea that this is a place in which time almost stands still and in which everyone is a bit more backward than in the city. And we often get a sense of a slight backwardness of the opposite of modernity, and this kind of rusticness from the more working class characters in the book, not necessarily from Bathsheba and Oak and Boldwood, who are presented as being a bit more educated, but from many of the people that work on the farm. We have some characters who have no idea how old they are, and we have a woman who has called her son Cain rather than Abel, because she thought that in the Bible story it was Abel that killed Cain rather than Cain that killed Abel. Yet at the same time, the farm workers do have quite an interesting, important role to play in the plot. A while ago, Libby Stevenson, whose channel I will link down below, was talking about Thomas Hardy in one of her videos and mentioned that often in Thomas Hardy novels, more working class characters take the role of a kind of Greek chorus. They comment on the plot and they give us news about it. And I had never thought about it like that before, but I think it's kind of awesome and a really, really interesting way to think about Thomas Hardy's books, especially as many of them do take the form of tragedies. so it makes sense that in some ways the working class characters are there as a sort of chorus to mirror a Greek tragedy. And on the one hand, the working class characters in Far From the Madding Crowd are being presented as very rustic and unsophisticated, but on the other hand, they also take the role of a Greek chorus, which kind of makes them more sophisticated, so I think that's quite interesting. But anyway, moving on to Wuthering Heights. I think in Wuthering Heights, the society is presented as being even further from sort of social norms and from ordinary behaviour. This book is really violent, and there's a lot of violence all the time, and people talk about violence as it's fairly ordinary. It's presented as being a harsh, harsh world. Many characters die within a couple of sentences, just passing comments on the fact that, oh yeah, that character got ill, they're dead now, yeah, moving on from that. And also there's a lot of violence between characters. Lots of people strike each other or try to attack each other, both male and female, both adults and children. Kathy strikes Edgar, Catherine pushes over a chair and makes Linton fall. Heathcliff and Hindley are constantly trying to kill each other. At one point, Hindley's baby falls and Heathcliff catches him, and Nellie says, had it been dark, I dare say he would have tried to remedy the mistake by smashing head and skull on the steps. No, that is not a normal thing to think that someone might have tried to do. Even handshakes are violent here. She seized Linton's reluctant fingers and crushed them into his. The language Emily Bronte uses throughout Wuthering Heights, often for ordinary things, is very, very violent, and then there is a lot of actual violence as well. It's really interesting to see how violent the world of this book is and how utterly brutal this rural culture is presented as being. Similarly, it is a place that is full of swearing. There are a lot of dashes throughout this book to symbolise when characters are swearing, even for characters who are pretty young children. We also have a lot of superstition in this book. There is a lot of talk of haunting from many of the different characters, and the language many of the characters use to insult each other with is supernatural. Characters call fellow characters imps or witches or devils or demons. They use supernatural and superstitious language in order to insult each other, and we do get the sense that this is a harsh world removed from society's rules, a place that is in many ways horrible and very, very backward and uncomfortable. Isabella calls Wuthering Heights that inhospitable hearth. This is not a comfortable place. This is an isolated, harsh, brutal world, and it's one in which society's rules often don't count. There are a lot of very taboo things that occur in this book that I'll talk about a little bit later on in the video maybe, as they're not that spoiler free. Certainly a lot of this book, normal rules of society don't seem to apply, which leads me on quite nicely to talking about class in rural areas in this book, because class is another area in both of these books where the rules that might apply in more urban areas don't really seem to apply here. Both of these books present a world in which there are quite slim boundaries between classes, and which there is to a certain extent quite a lot of social mobility. Oak's class and position shifts quite a lot over the course of the book. Bathsheba is a lady, she's educated, but she's also a farmer and she's also works. There's one scene in the book where Bathsheba hosts a sort of feast meal for her workers, and they set up the table by the window, so all the people who work on her farm sit around the table, and she sits at the end of the table but inside through the open window, so that she is separated from them because she's in a different class, but also she makes one of their table. She is both part of their class and of a different class. Similarly, we have Boldwood, who is a gentleman farmer. Boldwood was the tenant of what was called Little Wetherby Farm, and his person was the nearest approach to aristocracy that this remoter corner of the parish could boast of to genteel strangers. He is not a squire, he is not a lord, he does not own his own land, he is a tenant, but he is considered to be a gentleman and he's considered to be above a lot of the rest of society. When you read this book and think of Boldwood's position within society and the way that he is considered to be above by so many people, you might think that he was a lot wealthier and a lot more respectable, a lot higher up in class than he is. Whenever I see film adaptations of Far From the Madding Crowd, they often make all the houses too big. They give Mr. Boldwood a huge house, and they often give Bathsheba quite a large one too. Whereas all these characters, none of them are very, very wealthy, none of them are of a very, very high class. Mr. Boldwood does not own his own land, he is only a tenant. No one in this book is very, very rich, but Mr. Boldwood is seen as being of above many other people. So in that sense, the class distinctions are almost smaller at a more sort of micro level in the society where people are less apart from each other than in the cities. But at the same time, there is much more intermingling of the classes. For example, I already spoke about Bathsheba at that feast where she is half separated from her workers but also not completely. Similarly, Oak and Boldwood are from quite different classes, but it doesn't feel like they are, and they have a lot of conversations. There is much less separation between classes here than there would be in the city. If you read many novels set in the city, characters of different classes don't really interact. Here they do, but at the same time we don't have many representations in Far From the Madding Crowd of anyone who is really upper class. We have people who are middle class or lower middle class and working class, but we don't have anyone higher up the social spectrum. In Wuthering Heights we have a much broader social spectrum to look at. We have servants, we have people who work on the farm, but we also have people who are very upper class, the Lintons, and to be honest the Earnshaws are at least supposedly upper class, though often the Earnshaws don't act like it. And this is another way in which class is really interesting, because class doesn't operate in Wuthering Heights as you might expect it to. If we look in the second half of the book at the younger generation, we have Hareton, we have Linton, we have Catherine. These three people technically are all of the same class, but they really don't act like they are, and they don't have lives like they are. Catherine refuses to believe that Hareton could possibly be her social equal. When Lockwood first arrives at Wuthering Heights in the beginning, he finds it really confusing to work out who is a servant and who is a master. Heathcliff is the master, okay, but who is the girl that's there? Is that his wife? Is that a housekeeper? Is that his daughter, or his daughter-in-law, as it turns out to be? And then who is Hareton? Is that Heathcliff's son, or is it a servant? And he just can't work out what everyone's social position is and what everyone's relation to each other is, because class doesn't work in Wuthering Heights, because class has been really disrupted. And it's partly by Heathcliff, because Heathcliff is adopted into the Earnshaw family. He is made an equal of Cathy and Hindley in a way, but he is also not an equal because no one knows anything about his background. At times he is treated like a servant, at times he is treated like a son of the family. Heathcliff has a really dubious and constantly shifting class position throughout the entire book, and Heathcliff disrupts the sort of class and social position of so many of the other characters too. And it's really interesting to see how the class in this book operates in a way that you couldn't imagine it operating in a small town or a city. It's partly because there aren't many other people around. Similarly, if you look at the role that the servants play and the way Joseph and Nellie speak to their masters, they speak to their masters in a way that I don't think you would ever get a servant speaking to a master or mistress in a Victorian novel set in London or even in a small town. It's really interesting to see how class is much less secure and the rules of class much less set in stone in rural areas than they tend to be in Victorian novels set in more urban areas. Still in spoiler-free territory, I want to talk a bit about the influence of nature, landscape and the weather on the plot in these two books. One thing I noticed on this reread of Far From the Madding Crowd that I haven't ever noticed before is just how much of the book takes place outside. There are very few scenes that take place wholly inside in this book, and the vast majority of the important scenes take place outside, but a lot of the most important conversations and a lot of the most important moments in this book take place outdoors. The first time Bathsheba meets Troy is outside, the first time she meets Oak is outside, a lot of her conversations with Boldwood and Oak and Troy take place out of doors, and a lot of the most significant scenes in this book take place outside. It's really interesting to see how much the landscape and the outdoor world is important to the plot and to the scenes in this book. If you compare it with most of the books written in the Victorian period that takes place in urban areas where a lot of it takes place inside. In Wuthering Heights, as I've already mentioned, Cathy sometimes feels confined by being inside, and at one point when she's ill she says, "I wish I were out of doors." She wishes to be in some place that's outside, partly because the rural landscape for her and the outdoors is a place that she shares with Heathcliff, and it's a place, as I mentioned earlier, where rules don't seem to apply as much. I think it's also important to look at the change of season in both of these books and how the changes in season and weather influence both of the stories. Wuthering Heights begin with snow, with rough weather, and one of the very first things that happens in this book is that Lockwood gets snowed in Wuthering Heights, and that's when his interest in Mr. Heathcliff and Mr. Heathcliff's past and family begins. That is why he goes and asks Nellie Dean, who tells him a story, which is how the whole book begins. The book begins with snowing in and moves on throughout the book into various different seasons. Far From the Madding Crowd also has snow at one point in the book, but that snow is passable. Unlike Wuthering Heights, where snow means you get snowed in Far From the Madding Crowd people do walk through the snow, and although there is snow at one point in the book, it doesn't seem as impassable as it does in Wuthering Heights. And it's also quite interesting in Far From the Madding Crowd to notice the role that the seasons play, because they are really, really important. The landscapes change with the season and we get to see see time progress in the book through the way that seasons are described. And the seasons as well in Far From the Man and Crowd are bound up with the work that needs to be done at that time and the farming calendar. It was now early spring, the time for going to grass with the sheep when they have the first feed of the meadows before these are laid up for mowing. And later, it was the first day of June and the sheep shearing season culminated, the landscape even to the leanest pasture being all health and colour. Every green was young, every pore was open, and every stalk was swollen with the racing currents of juice. God was palpably present in the country, and the devil had gone with the world to town. In Wuthering Heights too, the season massively affects the landscape and the world around them. In winter, nothing more dreary. In summer, nothing more divine. So that is it for the spoiler-free section of the video. I have a lot more to say, but that is going to be in a more spoilery way. So if you have not read either of these two books, or I should say if you have not read both of these two books, please do head away now and I'll be back very soon with another video. But if you have read both of these books and would like to stay, let's carry on talking about the importance of nature, the landscape and weather in both of these two books. To continue talking about the importance of the landscape in Far From the Man and Crowd, as I mentioned earlier, most of the key scenes in this book take place outside. To go into a little bit more detail, Oak proposes to Bathsheba outside. He discovers the loss of his farm and his livelihood outside. When he first arrives at Bathsheba's farm, he helps save the farm from fire outside. The majority of their conversations take place outside, and the majority of significant turning points in their relationship take place outside. An exception, of course, is at the very end of the book, where she goes to his house in order to kind of court him a little bit. And many of the rest of the important scenes in the book take place outside. A lot of Bathsheba and Baldwood's conversations take place outside. She meets Troy outside, and there is that massively important scene where he kind of seduces her by doing a weird military thing with a sword. And after Troy and her have that massive argument about Fanny Robin, Bathsheba's first instinct is to go outside and hide in the landscape. The first time that she definitely noticed her position was when she reached a gate leading into a thicket overhung by some large oak and beech trees. On looking into the place, it occurred to her that she had seen it by daylight on some previous occasion, and that what appeared to be an impassable thicket was really a brake of fir now withering fast. She could think of nothing better to do with her palpitating self than go in here and hide, and entering she lighted upon a spot sheltered from the damp fog on a reclining trunk, where she sank down upon a tangled couch of fronds and stems. She mechanically pulled some armfuls round her to keep off the breezes and closed her eyes. She sleeps outside and she finds solace in nature. And when Liddy asks her if she's coming back to the house, she says, "I shall not come indoors yet, perhaps never." She declares that she might never come inside again, as though being outside in the landscape, outside in nature, is somehow better. But the other really key scene that takes place indoors is when Baldwood shoots Sergeant Troy. And what's really interesting is that in several television adaptations or film adaptations of this, they make that take place outside. They make Baldwood come outside into the snow to shoot Troy. Now, I want to talk a little bit about rain in both of these books, because rain has quite an important role to play in both of these books. And also, I want to talk a little bit about pathetic fallacy, which is where sort of weather mirrors or foreshadows events in the plot and what's going on in the rest of the book. So one important incident of a storm in Far From the Man and Crowd is after Bathsheba and Troy's wedding party, where Troy gets all of the farm workers drunk, refuses to cover up the hay, which means that they will all get wet and a lot of work and time and money will be ruined. And it's Gabriel Oak and Bathsheba, pretty much the only sober people on the farm, who go and cover the stacks of wheat in order to prevent disaster and a great loss of money. 10 minutes later, his lonely figure might have been seen dragging 4 large waterproof coverings across the yard, and soon 2 of these heaps of treasure and grain were covered snug, 2 cloths to each. £200 were secured. 3 wheat stacks remained open and there were no more cloths. Later there's lightning and the storm begins, and there's a very powerful moment here I want to read, which is a powerful sort of emotional moment, but a slight shift in their relationship, but also a moment of humanity feeling very, very small in comparison to the sublime nature and the natural world. Gabriel was almost blinded, and he could feel Bathsheba's warm arm tremble in his hand, a sensation novel and thrilling enough, but life, love, everything human seemed small and trifling in such close juxtaposition with an infuriated universe. And this massive storm really foreshadows the complete terrible mistake that Bathsheba has made in marrying Troy. Troy, especially because Oak is the person that fixes it, and you see in the way they work together, almost Oak and her as the true partnership here. And the storm and the way that Troy is completely careless about it mirrors the sort of careless mistake that Bathsheba has made in her life. And it's also important to note that on this particular night, Boldwood also forgets to cover his rickets and his stock is ruined, which is a real turning point in terms of showing the sort of madness that he is growing into. Similarly, Rain has a really important and destructive role to play later on in the book after Fanny Robin's death, when Troy has set up this beautiful, glorious, expensive grave for her, and then the rain comes and ruins it. Flowers so carefully planted by Fanny's repentant lover began to move and writhe in their bed. The winter violets turned slowly upside down and became a mere mat of mud. Soon the snowdrops and other bulbs danced in the boiling mass like ingredients in a cauldron. Plants of the tufted species were loosened, rose into the surface and floated off. This is a moment of great dramatic significance because it not only shows the great power of weather and nature to destroy, but it also suggests that in a way nature is protesting against the situation and refusing to let Troy have comfort. And this moment and the force of nature here also brings Troy to a kind of point of epiphany. Almost for the first time in his life, Troy, as he stood by this dismantled grave, wished himself another man. And it's perhaps the first time, I think, that you see an acknowledgement in Troy that he might have done something wrong and that he might not be as good a person as he has perhaps thought he was. And rain is incredibly important in Wuthering Heights as well at specific moments. For example, Heathcliff leaves in this terrible storm, and Cathy's illness, which ends up being reoccurring and eventually leads to her death, is caused by her going out in the rain looking for Heathcliff. And we see this kind of pathetic fallacy, the idea that the rain is mirroring the torment in Heathcliff when he leaves, but also the torment in Cathy that he is gone. Similarly, immediately after Cathy's death, the weather goes bad. In the evening, the weather broke. The wind shifted from south to northeast and brought rain first, then sleet and snow. On the morrow, one could hardly imagine there had been 3 weeks of summer. The primroses and crocuses were hidden under wintry drifts. The larks were silent, the leaves of the early trees smitten and blackened, and dreary and chill and dismal that morrow did creep over. This is immediately after Cathy's death. The weather seems to respond to her loss. And later, Heathcliff almost seems to believe that Cathy has become one with the landscape and with the weather. He believes that he is haunted by her, and he throws open the window to let the wind and in a way to let her in. And at the very end of the book we have this vision of them kind of haunting the moors together, as though after both of their deaths they sort of become one with the landscape. I want to talk a little bit about taboo in rural areas because I couldn't really talk about this in full detail earlier in the spoiler-free part of the video. I think it's important that in the very key scene in Far From the Madding Crowd, where Troy performs his military sort of drill with his sword for Bathsheba in order to kind of captivate her, that this meeting between two single people, which is fairly inappropriate within Victorian society, takes place in a bit of land that is not farmland, in a bit of wild land where the rules of the rest of the more constrained rural landscape don't seem to apply as much. The hill opposite Bathsheba's dwelling extended a mile off into an uncultivated tract of land. This is a wilder bit of the environment where rules don't seem to apply so much. And again, to talk a bit about the way that rules don't apply in Wuthering Heights, I do want to talk a little bit about taboo here and the way that many of these things feel like they couldn't happen in a more structured, rigid and urban society where there are more people. Heathcliff himself is quite a taboo character. He is an adopted foster child who at first sort of takes on the role of son of the family, and later, after his sort of foster parents' death, ends up being treated as a servant. His class position and his lack of class position in many ways is in itself a taboo. His and Cathy's relationship is very, very taboo, partly because they are foster siblings, partly because there are vague implications that Heathcliff might be a biological illegitimate child of Mr. Earnshaw. I do think there are very vague implications of that in the book. I think it's probably not the case, but I think you can make a fair argument for that, which would make his and Cathy's relationship not only sort of semi-incestuous by the fact that they are brought up together and are foster siblings, but also actually incestuous. But leaving them aside, the relationships between these two households are quite incestuous. Catherine marries twice. She marries two of her cousins. Edgar Linton marries Cathy, and his sister Isabella marries Heathcliff, who is Cathy's foster brother. There's a lot of intermarrying between the Earnshaws and the Lintons and the Heathcliffs, I suppose. And there are moments of a great taboo in this book, leaving aside all the violence. If you think about the one moment where Heathcliff digs up Cathy's grave, that is so bad, and it feels as though the rules of society don't seem to apply to him, don't seem to apply to this area. It would be an impossible thing to do in a more densely populated area, but in these desolated, isolated rural locations, the implication is that the same social rules don't really seem to apply. And next I want to talk a little bit about the use of sort of language in both of these books, because I think it's quite interesting. In Far From the Madding Crowd, it's interesting to note characters' names. We have Bold Wood, we have Oak, we have Fanny Robin, referring to trees or birds, referring to natural things. And these three characters, I think, are juxtaposed quite interestingly with Troy, which has a name, has no natural connotations, but obviously has those of sort of military and historical significance. In the opening paragraph of Far From the Madding Crowd, Gabriel Oak's face is described as being like a landscape. When Farmer Oak smiled, the corners of his mouth spread until they were within an unimportant distance of his ears. His eyes were reduced to chinks, and diverging wrinkles appeared round them, extending upon his countenance like the rays in a rudimentary sketch of the rising sun. His wrinkles extend like rays of the sun. Hardy talks about the distances of his face as though it were a landscape. In Wuthering Heights, when Cathy explains to Nellie Dean her love for Edgar and her love for Heathcliff and the differences in it, the only way she can define it is to use natural imagery. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so that he shall never know how I love him, and that not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning, or frost from fire. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a sort of little visible delight, but necessary. She can only explain the way she feels about these two men by using natural languages. Heathcliff himself is often compared to the landscape. He is described as being an arid wilderness of firs and whinstone. And when Heathcliff adopts Hareton, he compares them both to trees. He says, "We'll see if one tree won't grow as crooked as another with the same wind to twist it." And I think it's really interesting to see how natural imagery and natural connotations influences the language in these books so much. But I think that is coming up to the end of what I have to say about both of these books, and I do want to talk a little bit about the overarching view of landscape and rural areas in both of these books. I think it's fair to say that although in Far From the Madding Crowd, landscape and nature and the weather can be dangerous, and we do have many important disasters that happen or are nearly averted that are caused or would have been caused by nature. For the most part, the landscape is something that is ordinary and that is worked on. It is beautiful, it can at times be sublime, but it is part of everyday life, and it's more of a workable background. This rural area is presented as rustic, as picturesque, but it's not presented as being sort of violent and backward to the same extent that it is in Wuthering Heights, where I would say that the landscape is less idyllic, less picturesque and more menacing. It can be beautiful at times, it is sort of sublime in its power, but it also is presented as being this place that can be threatening. The moors are more isolating in Wuthering Heights than they are in Far From the Madding Crowd, and the rules of society are therefore more able to be broken in Wuthering Heights than they are in Far From the Madding Crowd. Partly, I think, as I mentioned earlier, this is a little bit to do with it being a sort of southern versus northern rural landscape in Britain, but it's also partly to do with the level of isolation and the level of ruralness, in a way, in both of these places. I think both of these books are really, really interesting to look at in terms of the presentation of rural areas and landscape within the Victorian period. Also important to note, which I haven't really talked about that much, that Wuthering Heights is set a little bit before the Victorian period, whereas Far From the Madding Crowd is probably set during the Victorian period, although I don't think the dates are made that clear. And that also partly, I think, influences the idea of the rural landscape in Wuthering Heights as being very backward, because it is set that little bit earlier too. I think that's pretty much getting to all I had to say about these two books. The idea of the rural and of the influence that landscape can have on culture and on people is really, really interesting in a lot of Victorian literature, and a couple of other Thomas Hardy books I'd really recommend in terms of looking at that is The Return of the Native and also The Woodlanders. Both of them are really interesting in terms of looking at the impact of nature and landscape on people. And some other Gothic Victorian literature deals really interestingly with isolation in rural areas too, for example Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, or Uncle Silas by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. But I think this has probably been a long enough video, and that's pretty much all I have to say about rural landscapes in these two brilliant Victorian novels. Please let me know if you've read any other Victorian novels you think deal really interestingly with landscape, and what other thoughts you had on these two books and their depiction of rural areas. The Not So Hypothetical Victorian Literature course will be back in April, where I'll be talking about money in Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens and The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, a video I am very, very excited to make, and I'm so excited, so very excited to reread the way we live now in the next month or two. So that is it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back soon with another bookish video. Hypothetical class is now dismissed.